Hi everyone, and welcome to the rebuild of the Seiko 6139 Pogue chronograph. And as you can see here, I'm using a movement holder which I designed and printed in PLA filament on my Ender 3 3D printer. And you can see that it's designed so that the movement will snap securely into the holder and will not drop out. It's not so tight that you have to force it in, but it's not loose enough that it will move around or fall out of the holder. We begin reassembly with the center wheel, followed by the center wheel bridge. I do apologise for partially obscuring the view with, well, you can just see the top of my glasses there, and I must try and make sure I avoid leaning over the movement like that in future, but it is quite difficult when you're trying to get an acceptable angle to film. If the camera is too angled, because you're focusing quite closely, you need quite a small aperture to get everything in focus, whereas if it's more straight down like this, it's easier to get the movement in focus. So the reassembly continues with the mainspring barrel with its new mainspring, and then the third wheel, escape wheel and fourth wheel, after the pivot of the fourth wheel, which is the chronograph runner, is lubricated. Here we see the train bridge, and before fitting the train bridge, the column wheel, its collar and retaining screw are refitted to the plate. This can be done afterwards, but you do have to use a little bit of pressure on the spring that you see there that's riveted to the plate, which locks the column wheel in place. And it's easier to do with the plate off of the movement, and is recommended in the Seiko manual itself, in fact, but it can be done afterwards, so it's not an enormous problem if you forget to do this before fitting the plate. The next step is to fit the train bridge, make sure that everything aligns and spins freely, and this is then secured by 3 same length screws. Next to be fitted is the click and the ratchet wheel. The click and click spring is a combined unit, and very much like you would find on most Seiko movements, or certainly most Seiko movements from the 70s onwards. And of course the upper barrel, or the upper barrel arbor jewel, is lubricated before the ratchet wheel is fitted, and you can see there the new jewel that's in place. The click and the ratchet wheel are new old stock replacement parts, because both were quite worn on the original watch, to the extent where the ratchet wheel was actually slipping and not catching on every tooth as it rotated. At this point here, I'm fitting the chronograph bridge, and this is purely to test that the movement actually runs freely, so that I could place it on the time grapher and establish that it ran freely enough before fitting the chronograph components. Because if you discover after fitting all the chronograph components and getting it all together that something's amiss, you then have to strip the whole thing right the way back down to the train bridge and start looking for reasons why. Here you'll notice the pallets in the pallet bridge are installed. I seem to have missed a bit of footage where I go ahead and install that, so apologies for that. And at this point I'm just fitting the balance, and this is after adding a little bit of wind to the mainspring. A little bit of finagling of the balance wheel, and that starts to beat, as you can see. And then with the balance bridge screws tightened, this is then checked on the time grapher to ascertain that everything is running freely and it's giving a good trace. At which point we strip that back down to the train bridge. Note that I've left the pallets and the balance wheel in place whilst doing this. It's always advisable to have them removed when you're working on a chronograph movement and you're putting the train or any of the chronograph components in, just for safety. But in this case I was comfortable enough to go ahead with those in place, and on these it's not quite so important as on the Swiss chronographs, because the setup is very slightly different. With the Swiss ones, it's very easy to knock the extended fourth wheel driving wheel, for example, and damage the pallets. But do bear that in mind. If you're rebuilding your own, it's actually recommended to have the balance and the pallets removed whilst fitting all the chronograph components. The two arms that actuate the chronograph are slotted into place, and the contact points where metal touches metal are greased. There are two screws, one which goes into the arm on the right hand side of your screen, and then a shouldered one which fits into the top, the shoulder, allowing the pivot points to move freely underneath it, yet still lock it in place. Next to be fitted is the hammer. Once again, apologies for partially obscuring the movement there. And there I'm just moving the column wheel around to check that everything aligns and that the hammer actually drops into the slot as it should for the reset procedure. And there you'll see the intermediate driving wheel and the minute recording wheel, which shows as the brass coloured one at the top of your screen. Ordinarily, what I'm doing there, you wouldn't see the pivots of a minute intermediate recording wheel or the minute recording wheel oiled, because on a Swiss chronograph the typical state is not running in use, and when it is used they move so infrequently that lubrication is not required and can actually be detrimental. Because the optimum state for the vertical clutch column wheel chronographs by Seiko is constantly running, I prefer to add a very small amount of 9-10 on the pivots, just to give them a little lubrication. And here we're fitting the second of the two springs. The first one fits in quite easily, as you saw just a moment ago. This second one is much more fiddly, and it's easy for it to ping off and disappear across your bench and across your workshop. So make sure that you use, in my case, a finger with a finger cot on to hold that around the post while you locate it, or a piece of pegwood or similar, as it's very easy to lose. Following this, the chronograph bridge is fitted, which is held in place by 3 screws. And then the return spring, which is riveted to the chronograph bridge on the upper part of your screen there, that you see on the upper part of your screen, is hooked behind the pivot on the hammer and greased accordingly. You'll note there that the lower screw fell into the hole which the auto winding part goes into, and hence my securing both of the other screws before tipping the movement up to retrieve it, because it didn't want to come out. And this is one of the handy things of this holder, because it's gripped in there nice and firmly, it's not going to drop out on you. And there I'm just lubricating the upper pivots of the column wheel, the minute recording wheel and the intermediate wheel. Again, as I say, typically the intermediate and the minute recording wheel would not be greased, or lubricated rather, but because in default use this would be left running all of the time, it's something that I feel is beneficial to do. There you can see the finger on the chronograph runner, which moves around and moves the intermediate wheel, which in turn moves the minute wheel, which you will see just about here, and you will see that click around as it reaches the minute mark, and that's been left running just to check and verify that it all does what it should do, and then we operate the reset. Now onto the dial side. This side is quite straightforward and very much like many Seikos, especially if you've done any of these 6309 series. You'll be very familiar with the layout on this. So first you have the large strong return spring for the quick set day date mechanism. This is screwed in place, the contact points are greased, and then using a pair of sturdy tweezers, which you can just see, that's moved over and hooked into the mechanism, which is riveted to the plate. There are several components that are permanently riveted to the main plates of these movements, and that can make lubricating them a little bit tricky. There are some parts which you would conventionally use grease on. In the case of these, it's not feasible to apply grease to the actual pivoting parts, because you simply cannot get an oiler in there to do that. In the case of those, I used D5 as it's a thick oil, but it will allow it to penetrate to the moving parts. And there I'm just adding the motion works for the train, the cannon pinion, the minute wheel, the intermediate wheel for time setting, and then the plate which covers the both of those. This is held by two screws, the lower one of which is a smaller head and chamfered, and the larger one is a flat non-chamfered head. And just above that, where I'm screwing the screw in, you can see the lower barrel arbor jewel. This component here simply slots over the two pegs of the quick day date change system, which I've just moved temporarily out of the way. That's just to demonstrate how that sits, and you'll be able to see that in operation in a little while. And here I'm fitting the setting lever, so we add a little bit of lubrication to the post, and that just drops into place. Followed by the yoke and yoke spring, which is one complete assembly. Applying a little grease to the pivot points and to the clutch where the yoke engages. applying a little grease between where the yoke and the setting lever contact each other before we go on to fitting the setting lever spring. At this point of the rebuild, I had an unfortunate incident of one of the screw heads breaking, which you will see in just a moment. Ordinarily when this happens, and this is something, Seiko screw heads are not the best in the world. They tend to be very, very thin, and quite often I've had half of a screw head snap off on tightening. And I mean, believe me, I don't lean on these things when I'm tightening them. They're just very thin and seem to be much more fragile than your typical Swiss screw heads. So this is not an incredibly uncommon thing to happen, but you'll notice when I start to tighten this one here, it suddenly becomes frighteningly loose, and you'll see there that the screw head has parted company, leaving the remainder of the screw in there. Now usually these wind out quite easily because they're not ordinarily tightened in. As a rule, you can get something like a needle and start to poke that anti-clockwise and get it to unwind. Unfortunately in this case it didn't want to play ball, but at this point, rather than start stripping things back here, I decided to continue, for the sake of the video, with the rebuild of the calendar components and then address the broken screw afterwards. Unfortunately, what happened was I had to strip the whole movement back down to access the screw from the other side because it just did not want to come out at all, and I had to strip it right back down to the base plate, and using a few tricks managed to get that broken screw out, whereupon the whole thing went back through the cleaning machine again. So this is currently probably the cleanest 6139 in the world, and then I had to dig out a spare screw of the correct thread pitch and length and size to replace the missing one for the setting lever. While the setting lever would have worked with just the one screw on, I wouldn't have been comfortable leaving it like that, and there would have been a possibility of that slipping at some point as well. So it's one of those things where I'm certainly happier knowing that it's been done and rectified. And there's the hour wheel, and that completes the time setting and date setting components. You'll note at this point where I'm adding the calendar ring that that screw has now been replaced. You'll note the slightly darker coloured head on the replacement one. So we were at the same point. The only difference, the only things added there are the jumper spring for the calendar ring itself, and then the cover plate, which is held by 4 screws, fits onto the top of this. Once this cover plate has been fastened down with all 4 screws, the day wheel simply drops in place, and the C-clip is fitted with the flattest side uppermost and pushed down with tweezers until it snaps into place. And here at this point I'm just testing the operation of the quick set day date mechanism and checking that it turns with the hand setting. The next thing to do is to fit the dial. So we fit the dial ring, and you'll notice it has cutouts for the dial ring screws and cutouts for the stem and the pushers. The number on the back of the dial is 73, as you can see there. I'm not an expert on these Seiko dates and what have you, but I believe that that dates it to 77 maybe. I'm not 100% sure on this. I'm far from an expert on the Seiko dating system, so if you know, please feel free to throw in a comment on there and let us know. And with the dial screws loosened, everything is held in place and that's tightened up. We can flip the movement holder over to the chronograph setting side, and you can see this similarly fits in dial up, and there's a little brass screw underneath there that you can adjust until it contacts the jewel, and this allows you to press the center seconds hand on firmly without displacing the upper pivot jewel for the chronograph runner. I hope to print and make and sell some of these holders, and also one for a 6138 as well, once I've finished refining that one. And this particular one was made as I went along, and this is the first real world test of using this movement holder for the entire procedure. So the hour and minute hands are fitted as normal. You rotate the time clockwise until the date just changes over, then the hour and minute hands are set at the 12 o'clock position. Once they're fitted, the whole assembly is rotated again 24 hours to verify that the day and date change as they should. Like so. Next to be fitted are the center seconds chrono hand, and this is done while holding in the reset pusher. You can see I've got my finger on the reset pusher there, and I have since shortened these. These again were just for test purposes, but I have since shortened those pushers a little. And with that held in, it holds the hammers flat to the faces of the chronograph hearts, ensuring that you can align and fit the seconds hand accurately. And this particular one is very slightly off by one increment to the right of 12 o'clock, and unfortunately with hands that have already been fitted like this one, you're kind of stuck with what it was set at, and it's close enough to not be a concern unless you're incredibly OCD, but it's not it's certainly not something that is an uncommon sight with these hands, because of the way that Seiko cut the stems. They actually cut their way into the seconds hand. The minute counter is much more straightforward, as it's just a round shaft, and obviously it's not under as much stress during running or reset, and this is just pressed on whilst aligned at the 12 o'clock position, again with the reset pushed in to ensure that the hammer is resting on the heart of the minute counter. And then the next step is to allow this to rotate and make sure that it counts and resets back to the 12 as it should. And here you can see it's just turning over the minute. With the watch running away on test in the background there, just chugging away, I'm going to reassemble the case which was cleaned earlier. So we've got the main case body, which has been cleaned. There's no polishing or anything, it's just been cleaned. We've got the tension ring spring and this ring that the crystal gasket sits on. We've got the gasket here, which we'll talk about in a moment. We have got the plastic timer ring that revolves within the revolving bezel, inner bezel I suppose you would call it, and that has just been cleaned with some Rodico because I don't want to risk damaging the font on there by any other method. And we have got a replacement Sternkreuz crystal just there. The part number, for those who might be interested, is XMD 330.821. That's for the 6139 speed timer variant. And then of course, to finish that off nicely, we've got the blue-red Pepsi tachymeter bezel. We've also got various other parts, the strap and the case back and so on, but obviously they will come later. I'll need to replace a few parts such as the spring bars. There is one usable spring bar out of them all because as you'll remember from the original one, there was some corrosion. Here, for example, there was corrosion all around here where there'd been water ingress near the start chrono button. That has been cleaned up. You can still see some evidence of the pitting there, but that's been cleaned up on the movement ring and tension spring. But all of the spring bars, excepting one, were badly corroded and were just waiting to fail. So they will be replaced with new ones. So we've got the case here. The first item to go in is the revolving bezel, like so, just sits in there. Next up is the tension ring, which sits around it, and then we have this metal ring which sits on top of that. That allows, with the crystal fitted, that allows a bit of gentle pressure, enough to hold this revolving bezel in place, but it's under spring tension, so that when it's rotated by the gear on the stem, it will rotate but stop wherever it is stopped accordingly. Because it's under spring tension, it won't slip back and forth and what have you. Now the gasket, which comes next, I was quite surprised to find that this was in fact quite supple, quite malleable and flexible and what have you. But I recently discovered on one of Spencer Klein's videos, and obviously those who watch Spencer Klein know that the man knows his Seikos, and he knows a good deal about Seikos and the history. And apparently these gaskets are made of Viton, which is a rubber, a type of rubber that's very, very resistant to all manner of things. It's fantastic stuff. It's the same stuff they use to make O-rings for fuel injection and such systems on vehicles. That's how good it is. It will resist solvents like fuel and what have you. You use a standard rubber O-ring in a fuel injection system or a carbureted system or what have you, it will harden, perish, crack, split and start leaking fuel everywhere. Viton, however, while they recommend that you change them at service intervals sort of annually or what have you, they are much, much better, more flexible. So that is why this is still flexible and in good condition. Now these get damaged by incorrect fitting. If the lip, for example, because they're an L shape, which you can maybe see there, hopefully, if the lip gets squashed and it's deformed and then it stays deformed, that obviously it will affect it. So they can get damaged, but that's generally through incorrect fitting, and of course they will eventually technically wear out as well, but that's quite good. Now apparently these are supposed to be fitted without any kind of lubrication. However, that kind of goes against my the grain with me. If there's a rubber gasket, then to my mind it needs, even if it's only a little bit, it needs a little bit of silicone grease, and that's what this one will get. It will get a little bit of silicone grease, but it will sit on here like so, making sure it's fitted firmly into place. I'm just going to sort of fit it in for the moment. The new crystal will then be fitted, making sure that it slips nice and securely into the gasket, not deforming it in the process, and then the bezel, using the case back press, crystal press, will be snapped on afterwards, completing the front half of the case with its new crystal. That's the procedure for that, and that completes the front of the case for us, at which point we can flip it over, and you can see it's all nice and clean now, and I can then go ahead and fit the movement, the pushers with their new O-rings, the stem with its new O-ring, and the rear gasket, which again is a new one, all of which will be fitted and lubricated with silicone grease, and that will then be able to sit and run on test for a little while. It's now been running for almost 30 minutes, as you can see there. We're just coming around the 29-minute mark, and it's completed a full circuit. It's important with the chronos to run a full circuit of the minute counter, just to make sure nothing's binding, catching or sticking, and then this will have a couple of days worth of testing. And once I'm happy with it and done any tweaks to the regulation that's required, it will be winging its way back to the owner. So there's just a quick time grapher shot to show you where we're running with that. Reasonably happy with the amplitude given the state of it when I took it apart. I'd never seen so many hairs in a watch. It was quite bizarre. Lots and lots of tiny little like small beard type hairs in it. It was incredible. I've never seen such a hairy watch. But the barrel arbors, of course, were jeweled, so it is now a 19 jewel 6139 rather than a 17 jewel, which is nice. And it did need a little bit of, had a bit of a kink in the hairspring, so it needed a little bit of tweaking there. And all in all, I'm quite pleased with how the whole thing is running. It has a replacement mainspring. The mainspring is technically slightly too weak for compared to the original, and it is only very slightly, but very slightly weaker than the original. So all in all, I'm quite pleased with that. It's giving sort of somewhere between 240 and 250 degrees on the amplitude there, dial up and dial down, which I think is very acceptable for an old thing like this fella here. Here's the finished watch. Everything's back together and new seals throughout. So just going through the operations, you can see that the bezel rotates with the rotation of the crown, and that's nice and smooth. The day and date, I'll just move the hands out of the way so you can see that better. The day and date works on a pusher, so if you give it if you push it all the way, that will change the day and the date, like so. Once you've got the day selected, a half push will change just the date, like so. And pull out the crown, there's only one position, and if we rotate that around, you will see, try and keep this in frame and in focus for you, that we've got the date change at midnight and shortly after the day change, like so. The chronograph, start, stop, restart, reset. The reset's actually quite soft on this. It's it takes a little while. I think the chronograph wheel is binding very, very slightly on the actual pivot, the chronograph runner, and I think the wheel is binding very slightly on that, because there is a slight drop in amplitude when you stop the chronograph. Not a huge amount, but it's there, and there really shouldn't be much difference. and sometimes with the reset it doesn't snap back in one go. You have to sort of press it and hold it to get that to reset back. And ordinarily you would leave these running all the time anyway. The solution, of course, would be to replace the chronograph runner, but as they're not so readily available these days, you kind of got to go with it, I think, and I think that is good enough. But I think that's what's happening is when you're going for the reset, like so, it's sticking a little bit, as you can see, but it does reset to 0. It's actually just slightly off the 0, but that's purely down to how it was keyed on before, but it's only very, very slightly, so it's very close. But it does run okay. It starts, it stops, and it runs okay. But I did notice when I was oiling the point on the chronograph runner where you oil, where the geared wheel and the pinion sit, it really didn't want to move under pressure from the tweezers where you apply the oil at all. So I had to go very, very carefully with that, because rather than risk damaging it, I just gave that a small amount of oil, using as much force as I dare without risk of damaging it further. And at least it's running. So, you know, had I actually slipped and damaged the chronograph runner, then it would have been a case of a complete replacement. But it is running, it is working. So far it's keeping time quite well. I've just done an initial regulation and it's all done, barring a couple of days test running and then some fine regulation. The case has been cleaned up. There's not been any polishing or anything done, but the case and original bracelet have been cleaned up. There's quite a bit of play on the bracelet. I don't know if that's how they are as standard. And here are the used spares. We've got an acrylic crystal. It's been placed with a Sternkreuz glass crystal. The case back gasket that was on, which has kind of stiffened and started to get brittle. We've got 3 of the spring bars here which were corroded, and if you were watching the first one you'll have seen that there was evidence of water ingress as well at some point, and around the movement ring holder, which has been cleaned up, and 2 of the spring bars were corroded. 1 was bent, as you can see there, and then this here is the remnants of the stem gasket. The pusher gaskets, 1 was missing and 1 was only half there, and they were just absolutely rock hard, no good whatsoever. So this has had a complete new set of gaskets with the exception of the crystal gasket, which was good. So new chronograph pusher gaskets, stem gasket and case back gasket. That's been put on the vacuum tester and has been left for a good half an hour and tested just fine. So I'm quite happy with that overall. And then there we've got the little packet of complimentary grease from VTA, which I thought was a nice little touch. It's just a little dab of silicone grease. I'm not sure which one he uses, but that's very, very sticky. The one that I use isn't as sticky as that. But I thought I would go ahead and use that, try that, seeing as he included it in the packet, and I'll be throwing that back in to go back to the owner so that he can make use of what's left in there. And there's the packet for the original crystal. So all that's going to be popped back into that bag to go back along with the watch. But there we go. It's another 6139 Pogue with the gold dial, and lives to tick again another day. I'm not 100% happy with the chrono reset, but as I say, I suspect that is just due to the chronograph runner sticking slightly, and short of trying to dismantle it to check and clean and reassemble, which I'm not prepared to do unnecessarily when it is working. There's really not much else you can do other than replacement. So that's where we are at. I'm calling that completed, with the exception of a couple of days testing and a little bit of fine tuning on the regulation. So far it's been running overnight since last night before I put in all the auto winding works and redid the seals, and that was keeping time quite nicely sat on the desk. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this little series on the Pogue, the 6139 speed timer with its gold dial, gold face, and we will see you in the next video.